Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most famous, most decisive battles in all of history, Waterloo. We're talking about a single day of combat that ended 23 years of almost non-stop war and brought the incredible career of Napoleon Bonaparte to a final, bloody end.
But here's the thing. This was no sure thing. Listen to the man who won, the Duke of Wellington himself. He said it was fought on a razor's edge. This was a titanic showdown between three massive armies and two of the greatest generals to ever live. It was a fight that would topple one empire and clear the way for another. So here's what we're going to cover. We'll track Napoleon's unbelievable comeback, follow the armies as they slam into each other in Belgium, witness the brutal back and forth of the battle itself, and then look at what happened after the smoke cleared and how it completely reshaped the world. Okay, so let's set the stage. How on earth did we get to this point? Well, it all kicks off with one of the most stunning comebacks you'll ever hear about.
You see, Napoleon had already been beaten. He was exiled on the tiny island of Elba. His story was supposed to be over. But then, in February 1815, he just escaped. He lands in France with just a handful of guys. But his personality, his legend, was so powerful that the soldiers sent to arrest him ended up joining him. In 20 days, he marched to Paris and was emperor all over again. You can just imagine the panic among the other European leaders. They were stunned, and they immediately declared him an outlaw and started getting their armies ready for another war.
Now, Napoleon was in a serious bind. The coalition of his enemies could bring almost 800,000 soldiers against him. He had less than half that. His only chance was to move first and move fast. The strategy was classic Napoleon. Hit them before they can group up. He planned a lightning strike into what's now Belgium to find the two Allied armies closest to him and destroy them one by one before the massive Austrian and Russian armies could even get on the march.
All right, so let's look at the players. On one side, you have Napoleon's Army of the North. We're talking 72,000 battle-hardened veterans, guys who were fiercely loyal to him. Facing him was the Duke of Wellington, with a 68,000-strong army he himself called infamous. It was a real patchwork quilt of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German soldiers. And then there was the third major player, the tough, aggressive Prussian army, led by the old warrior Marshal Blücher.
So on June 15, 1815, Napoleon crosses the border and he totally catches the Allies off guard. Wellington famously said, "Napoleon has humbugged me, by God." The emperor's first move was brilliant. He drove a wedge right between the British and Prussian armies, setting himself up to fight them separately.
And on June 16th, he gets to work. Napoleon throws his main force at the Prussians and gives them a real beating at the Battle of Ligny. Meanwhile, his top marshal, Ney, gets into a slugfest with Wellington's troops and fights them to a draw. So Napoleon got a win, but it wasn't the knockout punch he needed. And here's the crucial part. The Prussians, even though they were defeated, didn't run away. They retreated north, keeping themselves parallel to Wellington's army, dead set on linking back up. That right there, that was a game-changing decision. And this is where Napoleon makes a mistake. A really, really big one. He sends a third of his army, 33,000 men, under Marshal Blücher, to chase after the Prussians. But his orders were vague. For a general whose entire genius was based on having every man at the right place at the right time, this was a colossal blunder. Grouchy's force would spend the day of the main battle basically chasing ghosts, completely absent from where they were needed most.
Okay, so Wellington pulls his army back to a spot he actually checked out a year before. It's a low ridge just south of a village called Waterloo. He gets a promise from Blücher that the Prussians are marching to help him, so he decides this is the place to make his stand. And it was a brilliant defensive choice, with 3 fortified farm complexes that he turned into powerful anchors for his battle. On his right, he had the big chateau of Hougomont. Right in the center, guarding the main road, was the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte, defended by elite German soldiers fighting for the British. And on his far left was the little village of Papelotte. Wellington packed these places with troops, turning them into deadly little fortresses that would become absolute meat grinders. The battle finally kicks off around 11:30 in the morning on June 18th. Napoleon starts with what was supposed to be a small attack on Hougomont, just to distract Wellington. But it quickly turns into a massive, brutal fight that lasts all day. At one point, a huge Frenchman nicknamed the Smasher literally breaks down the main gate with an axe, but a handful of British guardsmen fight like mad to slam it shut again. The struggle for Hougomont became its own vicious battle within the larger one.
Then, around 1 p.m., Napoleon brings out the big guns. And I mean big. He lines up 80 cannons into a grande batterie and just pummels Wellington's line. But Wellington was clever. He had placed most of his men on the reverse slope of the ridge, hidden from view. So a lot of those cannonballs, which were designed to skip along the ground, just flew right over their heads. Right behind that cannon fire comes the first huge infantry assault. We're talking 14,000 men marching up the muddy hill in giant columns. They smash into Wellington's front, and the Dutch-Belgian troops holding that section start to buckle under the pressure. For a second there, it really looks like the whole Allied line is about to break. But just when things look their bleakest, Wellington plays his ace. He unleashes his heavy cavalry. 2,000 horsemen thunder over the ridge and just crash into the French infantry, scattering them completely. It was an incredible success. But they got carried away. They charged way too far, got exhausted, and were then ambushed by French cavalry. They were absolutely decimated. A stunning victory turned into a disaster in minutes.
So with that first big French infantry push beaten back, the battle shifts gears. And this is where Napoleon's number 2, Marshal Ney, makes a huge miscalculation. He sees some wounded soldiers being moved to the rear and thinks Wellington's whole army is retreating. He decides, on his own, to try and break them with cavalry. And what he does next is legendary. Ney launches one of the biggest, most incredible cavalry charges in military history. In total, something like 9,000 French horsemen, coursiers in shining armor, lancers with their deadly spears, charge up the hill in wave after wave.
So how in the world do you stop thousands of charging horses? With a classic, brilliant defensive move, the infantry square. Wellington's soldiers form up into these hollow boxes with bayonets pointing out on all sides. It creates a wall of sharp steel that horses physically will not charge into. These squares became like little islands of defiance in a sea of French cavalry.
And that quote from someone who was there just paints the perfect picture. For hours, these massive cavalry charges would just wash over the battlefield, swirling around the squares but never breaking them. The French would charge, get shot to pieces, fall back, and charge again. It was an incredible spectacle, but it was costing them dearly.
But all that pressure did have an effect. While the cavalry kept the infantry squares pinned, French foot soldiers were finally able to storm and capture that central farmhouse, La Haye-Sainte. And this was a disaster for Wellington. The French now had a foothold right in the middle of his line. They brought up cannons and started blasting his center to bits from close range. His army was on the verge of collapsing.
Wellington's line was stretched to the absolute breaking point. The Duke himself was heard muttering, "Night, or the Prussians must come." And just then, the tide finally started to turn. Over on Napoleon's right flank, the first of Blücher's Prussian troops finally show up and start attacking, forcing Napoleon to peel off precious soldiers to deal with this new threat.
Napoleon knew time was up. It was now or never. He played his final card, his last reserve, his most elite unit, the legendary Imperial Guard. These guys were the best of the best, veterans who had never ever been defeated in battle. They start their march up the ridge, but Wellington had one last trick up his sleeve. He had 1,500 of his own guardsmen lying down on the ground just over the crest, totally hidden. As the French guard reached the top, Wellington yelled, "Now, Maitland, now is your time." The British Guards stood up as one and fired a single devastating volley at point-blank range. And then the unthinkable happened. The Imperial Guards stopped, hesitated, and then they broke and ran. That was the moment. That was the turning point. A cry spread like wildfire through the French army. "La garde recule!" The Guard is retreating. Seeing their invincible heroes running for their lives sent a shockwave of pure panic through the ranks. All discipline just vanished. The army dissolved into a terrified mob, and the battle was lost. As the sun went down, Wellington and Blücher finally met on the battlefield, congratulating each other. It was over, but the consequences of this one day would echo across Europe for the next 100 years. But the victory came at a horrific price. Across a battlefield of just a few square miles, about 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. The fields were an absolute horror show of bodies. It was just unimaginable carnage. For Napoleon, the story was well and truly over. He abdicated just 4 days later. He tried to escape but couldn't, and ended up surrendering to the British. They exiled him to St. Helena, a lonely little island in the middle of the South Atlantic, and that's where he spent the last 6 years of his life.
his empire gone forever.
But here's the really big takeaway. The battle wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. It finally slammed the door on the Napoleonic Wars and kicked off a whole new power dynamic in Europe. It started a period of relative peace and British dominance that would last for nearly a century.
You know, the phrase "to meet your Waterloo" means to suffer a final crushing defeat, and for Napoleon, it certainly was. But the shockwaves from that one bloody Sunday in Belgium went on to shape the rise and fall of future empires, forge new alliances, and set the stage for the world we live in today.